All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Stan Veuger, Senior Fellow here at AEI, and I'm delighted to host this event on today's election in the Netherlands. I welcome you on behalf of the Netherlands American Foundation as well, today's co-sponsor of today's event. Good afternoon as well to our online viewership. For our online viewers, if you have questions, comments, feedback, please send them to beatrice.lee@aei.org or via Twitter with hashtag AskAEIEcon. Now, today, we're going to talk about Dutch elections. The departure from politics of the Netherlands' longest-serving Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, has scrambled Dutch politics to some extent. Incumbent Justice Minister Dilan Jijselgus now leads Rutte's VVD, VVD, and may become the Netherlands' first female Prime Minister, as well as the first foreign-born one. There's one guy who was born in Luxembourg in the 19th century. I'm not counting him because the Netherlands and Luxembourg were in a personal union at the time, and so it really is the first foreign-born one. To the VVD's left, Labour and the GreenLeft have joined forces. They're led by former Foreign Minister, former European Commission Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans. The new Social Contract Party is a new addition to the political spectrum. It's sort of a good government / anti-establishment centrist party, as Erik Voeten, one of our panelists, framed it on Monday, led by longtime Christian Democratic MP Pieter Omtzigt. He's a new competitor for sort of center-right voters. All of these changes to the Dutch political constellation come at a time when the Netherlands faces a number of domestic and international challenges and changes, including stark disagreements over immigration policy, which is what brought an end to the previous coalition, new European security environment with conflict in Ukraine, conflict in Israel, evolving attitudes toward trade with China, climate and energy transitions, thorny disputes related to nitrogen emissions, which we'll hear about a little from Arthur van Bentum, and a delicate macroeconomic environment as well. Now, more specifically to the election-related punditry, you should all have a handout that illustrates this new political spectrum. You will see on it the ballot for overseas voters on one side. I'm going to show this on screen for our online viewers. It highlights the broad variety of political parties in the Netherlands. The Netherlands, for those of you not as familiar, has a system of pure proportional representation, and parties that receive 0.7% of the vote receive a seat in parliament, right? So there's relatively easy entry of new parties. And so you see that reflected in the multitude of parties, many of which will actually end up with representation. On the flip side of your handout, you'll see the current composition of the Dutch parliament, both House and Senate, and a recent polling average for the House, which is what will be elected today. Now, some background: the Senate, or first chamber in Dutch, was elected in May and will serve until 2027, right? So that composition is not going to change. Dutch senators are part-time elected officials, and the chamber cannot initiate or amend legislation, but can block legislation. And so a governing coalition will ideally hold a majority or somewhat close to a majority of the seats in the Senate. It won't be easy. The main thing to remember about the Senate is that the Farmer Citizen Movement, BBB, holds a disproportionate number of Senate seats relative to its current polling. And so that makes it an attractive coalition partner from that perspective. Then the House, or second chamber, which is elected today, decides who gets to form the government. As you can see, it's relatively fragmented, and at least, I would say, 4 parties will be needed to get to a majority. Our panelists today are going to tell us which 4 those will be. With that background, let us turn to today's run of show. We're about to hear from Birgitta Tazelaar, Dutch ambassador to the United States. After her remarks, we'll hear from our panel of experts, Arthur van Bentum, Associate Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy at Wharton, also a member of the Education Committee of the Netherlands American Foundation, Matthias Matthijs, who is the Dean Eckesen Associate Professor of International Political Economy at SAIS, Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is Director of the Center on the United States and Europe at Brookings, and Erik Voeten, who is the Peter F. Krog Professor of Geopolitics and Justice in World Affairs at Georgetown. Outstanding title. We'll preview the results of the election until about 3 p.m. when exit poll results will come out, and that will give us a sense of the coalition math. We'll talk about that. We'll take some questions. But first, let me introduce Ambassador Tazelaar. Birgitta Tazelaar is the ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United States of America and non-resident ambassador to the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. She previously held the position of Deputy Director General for International Cooperation at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Prior to that, many other positions, both senior and junior, a career diplomat with 30 years of experience in political affairs, human rights, development cooperation. Ambassador Tazelaar has worked in the Middle East, Southern Africa, and the United Kingdom for a variety of bilateral and non-governmental organizations in both advisory and senior management posts. Ambassador, welcome. I look forward to your remarks.
And thank you for inviting me, and it's good to see all of you here. I know for you, you must be thinking about the turkey already, tomorrow being Thanksgiving. For us, it's just an ordinary Thursday. We don't celebrate that, but it's preceded by a rather important day, which is today, of course, the elections. What have we been seeing in the run-up to these elections? A few things. One is that current leaders who are quite well known, such as Rutte, but also Minister Kaag, Minister Hoekstra, have left or are leaving. And we have seen new leaders coming up. What we're also seeing is, as Stan mentioned, new parties. Of course, the Farmer Civilians Movement party was already there, but we've got a new party called the New Social Contract, and they split off from the Christian Democrats with Omtzigt as a leader, and that's, I think, a major development in the Netherlands. Also, mind the wording of that party, New Social Contract, between government and people. And as always, we have a lot of undecided voters. Well, the results we'll see later on, and the panel will say something about it. But in terms of coalitions, there's not a whole lot you can come up with, because if you count the polls, it will either be something along center-right, minority or not minority government, or it will be something more like a, let's say, rainbow, purplish type of coalition. Just a few words about the process. It's no longer the king that appoints somebody. Nowadays, it's Parliament who will first of all appoint a scout after the elections, and that scout will sit down with all the party leaders and will try to find out, where do you stand, what kind of coalition do you think will work, where do you see similarities, differences, etc. Based on that scouting, he or she will then give feedback to our Parliament, and our Parliament will have a debate about it, and based on that debate, Parliament will assign one or two people we call informateurs. There is no English translation for that, informateur, but these are people that will sit down with let's say, the most likely coalition to work out a coalition agreement. That sounds very simple. It is extremely difficult. The average time, this is a good question to the audience. What do you think the average time is? But there are those who know, they shouldn't play. The average time that a coalition is being formed, how many days do you think it takes? Anyone? A month, so that's 31 days on average. 6 what? 6 months? That's a little bit too much, that's a little bit too little. The average is 103 days, and the shortest ever was 31 days, the longest ever was 299, so that comes very close to what you said, even more than what you said, actually. So it takes a long time. What is really important in these negotiations is trust. Because these parties, they've been campaigning, they have been campaigning on their agenda, and to rebuild trust amongst each other while you've been debating each other fiercely over the last couple of months is an issue, and a lot of effort is put into rebuilding trust between those parties. There are different means that are being used for that. I know there was once a certain table that was taken from one location to the other, so everything that was negotiated around that table just stuck for the next meeting, or they go to places for a good atmosphere, to relax a little bit and find that mutual trust. We've had examples whereby we used cards, saying, okay, what's really important for you, health, for you this, okay, you can say, and different types of means to rebuild or to build that trust and come to a real compromise. That compromise then ends up in a coalition agreement. There have been very different types of coalition agreements, very short ones, very long ones. Both have advantages and disadvantages. If you've got a very long a coalition agreement, at least all the parties know what they agreed upon, but it also means that if there's a little bit of diversion in the years to come, you immediately have a crisis. If you have a very short coalition agreement, it means that you need to do a lot of negotiations during the process of governing, and that also brings challenges. So pros and cons there. So after the coalition agreement has been agreed upon, the parties will divide the portfolios, and the portfolios will then be filled with people, with ministers. Always a great party who gets a great play, who's going to get which function. When you look at the foreign policy, maybe a last couple of words about that. A lot of the campaign usually is about internal politics. I think it's the same in many countries, about housing or nitrogen or living standards, what have you. But there's also a bit of talk about international subjects that directly impact the Netherlands. Think about issues like migration or Ukraine or climate to a certain extent. So those kind of issues that have a direct impact on the Netherlands are also being discussed in these campaigns. And if you look at the different programs, at least I'm not worried about our 2% commitment to NATO, because most parties are in favor of that. There's also broad support for Ukraine. I don't see that changing very quickly. And I think there's also a growing mutual understanding when it comes to China. But there are a few subjects where there are a lot of differences between the parties. I think, for example, about development cooperation. Some parties want to get completely rid of it. Others want to maybe stabilize it. Others want it to grow. So that's a contentious subject. And migration is also a very contentious subject. Some parties want to stop irregular migration completely, no asylum seekers anymore. Others want to put a cap on it, and yet others do not want to put a cap on it, but want to have international law prevail when or not to give asylum to an immigrant or somebody seeking asylum. So there's a lot of challenge coming up, but one thing I am sure of, that is that our transatlantic relationship will remain strong under any given coalition that we're going to get. So, thank you very much.
Outstanding. Ambassador, thank you very much. I share that confidence. I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists onto the stage. You all have name signs here, some water. And then I'm going to kick it off by asking Erik Rutte to give his view of the situation, maybe talk about migration policy in particular. I saw you wrote a post for for Good Authority, the successor site to the monkey cage on Monday, so setting the stage, and so maybe you can give us some of that too.
Stan, thanks for inviting me here, and thanks for the AEI for organizing this event. We don't have a lot of events about the Netherlands in this city, so we're always very excited to talk about the Netherlands here. I should also advertise Good Authority, which is a new site. We used to have a blog on the Washington Post called The Monkey Cage, but we now migrated to our own site. It's a site where political scientists sort of share some knowledge for a broader audience from things that we study. I
figured you'd want to plug that. You know,
I do want to plug that. Yes, it's exciting. The elections here. So you have your stembiljet, as we call it here, with 27 parties, and we know of 17 parties in Parliament, including parties that might seem very unfamiliar to Americans. But actually, Dutch politics at the top has been very stable over the last couple of centuries, really. Over the last 21 years, we've only had 2 different prime ministers. They're not very exciting, probably, to outsiders, right? So Rutte and Balkenende, they were sort of center-right from the right. They let Rutte's cabinet collapse 3 times, but every time he came back. So he had 4 different cabinets in the end. So even if the politics may seem a little crazy to many of you with this many parties and new parties just emerging, there really has been a lot of stability at the top. And what's interesting about this election is that sort of seems to change at this time. At this moment, when we're looking at the opinion polls, there are 4 parties that could emerge as the largest party, including the far right, Wilders, who's been around for a long time. runs on a very strong anti-immigration platform based on Islamophobia, xenophobia. Then we have the VVD, which has been in power for a long time, but has a very different leader right now. Could have the first Dutch female prime minister who was born in Turkey. We have a new coalition on the left, as Stan pointed out, who could still emerge as the largest, especially if voters vote strategically today. Happy to talk about that in a little bit too. And then there's this new party, which was also referenced already, this new social contract led by Pieter Omtzigt, who's actually someone who's been in parliament for 20 years, so it's not really a new face on the scene, but he has gained prominence from parliament sort of leading investigations into a big scandal, and has gotten a really quick following. So last week when I wrote this piece for Good Authority, he was in the lead, now he's in 4th place, so it can go really fast. The other new party sort of is the citizen farmer movement that won the provincial elections, as Sten pointed out, which means they are the largest party in the Dutch Senate. Emerged really rapidly in the spring, won the most votes, and now it looks to get about like 3–4% of the vote or so. So it can go really fast with these new parties in Dutch politics. What's interesting about these new parties is they have something in common, and I think they capture something that really is at the heart of this Dutch election, a set of concerns among Dutch voters around something we call bestaanszekerheid. We had a long conversation before what the right translation is in English. Couldn't come up with something more exciting than something like economic security. And it relates to concerns about housing. Housing has gotten very expensive in the Netherlands, and it's gotten more so because housing starts have really declined over the last couple of years, partially for environmental reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, about the welfare state, pensions and inflation. So a set of concerns that have been raised around economic security, and these new parties have really formed around this. Those concerns have also reshaped debates about policy, including debates about immigration. As Stan pointed out, the last government collapsed over an immigration issue, but it was really intimately tied to these concerns about economic security, and not just to xenophobia or other types of sentiments that we might typically associate with immigration policy. So there were really 3 kinds of debates. The one is asylum seekers. So asylum seekers are a relatively small portion of Dutch immigrants, about 12% of immigrants. But there were big concerns about where they were being stationed, how they were being processed. They were being processed in very small cities in the east and the south of the country. These facilities were way understaffed. They did not have the capacity, so they were camping out in fields outside. There was a lot of concern about what these big sort of centers did to the local communities as well. So this farmer citizen movement came about not just for concerns over farmers, but also really this sort of effect on the countryside, right? So the argument here was that people in the big cities, they have no idea what they're doing to these small towns, and no concern really what they're doing to these small towns by housing, or at least temporarily sort of processing all these asylum seekers there. And then really tied into debates about housing as well, like the argument for housing lots of new asylum seekers, even temporarily, becomes very hard when there's such a stress on the housing market. We also got debates on immigration now over students. Dutch universities now have about 40–45% of foreign students, including some students not from the European Union, but also students from the European Union. So there have been proposals to require Dutch universities to start teaching more in Dutch, which is very difficult because they just hired lots of people who don't speak Dutch. So that complicates things. And there's debates about which fields are useful or not so useful. I'm a political scientist, so some of the politicians were saying, like, what use
Always on
are...
the edge of...
Yeah, no, we're way below the edge. Like, they were saying, like, why should we pay, for students coming to study political science in the Netherlands? There's no point to this. They may see the use of electrical engineering or so. But it's also related to housing, because there's a real
We economists always try to scheme our way into STEM classifications.
Yeah, economists are never on the chopping block. Political scientists often are. And then even like high-skilled migration. So Omtzigt, for example, has really challenged the fairness of rules that gave tax advantages to high-skilled immigrants from outside of the European Union. And the parties, so Omtzigt and the BBB, they try to remain sort of within a legal framework in their solutions. Wilders is completely outside of that. He just wants to do things that are contrary to existing Dutch law, EU law, and international law, with complete bans on immigration. But the other parties also, they want to sort of work around the edges there. So maybe I'll stop there and then.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And there's a bunch of things that we should talk about a little more. But first, I want to go to Arthur, who can maybe speak to some of the environmental dimensions of what Erik just mentioned.
Sure, happy to do that. Thanks for organizing us, Dan. So yeah, so roughly speaking, from a distance, I think I see the Netherlands as a center-right country, but there is no green-right political party. But that said, I think if you look at what most parties have done in the past, they've shown some commitment to climate change and the energy transition. So you look at the previous coalition government, for example. Now, was climate and environment, was that a main issue in the campaign? I would say it played some role, but of course it's really hard to beat immigration and housing. But as Erik alluded to, it was a very big issue, environmental issues, in the Dutch Senate elections earlier this year. The background is that the Netherlands is in a nitrogen crisis, so this is threatening nature. These are nitrogen emissions. Then what happened is that in 2019, the Dutch Supreme Court ruled that the government's policy to reduce nitrogen emissions was vastly deficient in terms of meeting the EU's Habitats Directive. So that was a really big issue, because essentially what that means is you need to cut cattle farming in half. And this led to the rise of the farmer citizen movement, over 20% of seats in the Senate. And what's interesting now is that this is looming in the background. But in the current campaign, it's been conspicuously absent because it's a very unpopular message. No one wants to talk about it. You don't want to tell people to buy out farms, to limit construction. But everybody knows this is going to come back to haunt us in sort of after the election.
Just for background, so nitrogen emissions, this is a completely separate issue from the climate transition. But this is a very local type of pollution.
Yeah. CO2 is a global pollutant, doesn't matter where it's emitted, but nitrogen is really about the local sort of, the chicken farms around some of the biggest nature areas in the Netherlands. It's a very local issue. But the EU has strict rules for that. One other thing before I get to the issues of the day, the environmental issues of the day in the campaign, keep in mind that actually most of the most stringent environmental regulation for companies in the Netherlands is already predetermined at the EU level. The EU has a very strict climate law. This is for 55% less CO2 emissions compared to 1990 by 2030. High carbon pricing, strict carbon pricing system. So almost whatever happens in The Hague, to some extent, there will always be a good degree of regulation coming from the European Union. Okay, so the issues of the day in terms of climate and energy transition, I would say electric vehicles. The Netherlands has over 40% of cars that are sold today are electric. It's a big leader, but to reach the 100% target in 2030, it's going to need continued very high subsidies, mostly going to the rich. And the political question is, are we really committed to sort of sticking with that target? Same for renewable energy. The Dutch climate strategy essentially hinges on building offshore wind in really, really large quantities between now and 2030. Offshore wind has had big setbacks, high interest rates, supply chain issues. It's going to be much more costly than we thought 3 years ago. And again, the question is, are we committed to sort of keep executing that policy? Now, what do the parties think? I would roughly sort of split them into 3 groups. You could say slightly less than a quarter of the vote falls into the right-wing category. Think about Wilders' PVV, the Freedom Party. Essentially, like they say, climate change is not a concern or doesn't exist. We just want to dial back all these regulations. Then I would say there is a couple parties. You can think about the Liberal Democrats, D66, or the Social Democrats and the GreenLeft. I would call them the Green Progressives. They basically say climate is an existential threat. We need to really race towards net zero, go double down on renewables, be a climate leader. The complete opposite, also about a quarter of the vote. And then in the middle, there's almost 50% kind of center-right parties that say, yeah, climate change is a concern. We don't deny it at all. We need to do something about it, but there's lots of other priorities. It's expensive. But they have shown at times to actually go along with pretty ambitious climate policy. So I think in summary, what I'll be watching is what is the probability that a coalition government will need one or maybe even two of these green progressives? If that's the case, they can't afford to join without a big win on climate, and they might then trade that with a big win for the center-right on, say, immigration. If it looks like that the GreenLeft or Social Democrats and or D66 are not going to be needed, I think it will get a drastically less ambitious climate policy. So I'm going to look at that sort of probability when the exit polls come out in a couple of minutes.
Outstanding. Thank you, Arthur. And just for people's orientation, so GLPVDA, that's the GreenLeft Social Democrats
Sorry, it's
combination.
so hard to, yeah.
So I was talking on the yesterday. I was talking on the phone to my parents about potential coalitions, and after I hung up, and my wife said, "What were you talking about?" It was it's all every coalition is 5 parties, right? So you're just listing acronym after acronym after acronym. Anyway, so that's part of what we're trying to avoid here. That's right. All right, very good. So that bunch of environmental issues that have not been on the forefront as much as I think they were earlier this year and especially last year, but certainly the nitrogen crisis is not going to go away, and it relates to housing too, right? Because either you dramatically reduce agriculture or you try to cut nitrogen emissions in different ways. So, for example, by pausing construction, infrastructure projects, et cetera. And so it really is. It seeps into basically every other debate, and I think that's part of why it was so salient for a while. So you talked about how certainly on the climate side, policy is set from Brussels. Well, fortunately, we have a Belgian here on the panelist, Matthias. How do you see this election? What do you think the implications are going to be for Europe? Also, just how do you told me that this election has gotten much more attention in Belgium than previous Dutch elections. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Stan. I want to echo what Erica said. There's not a lot of events in this great city on the Netherlands, so I jumped at the chance, having grown up in Belgium, to talk about Dutch politics and the Dutch role in Europe. So yeah, I'm wearing an orange tie for the occasion. I usually don't wear it. I usually don't wear a tie, actually. But so thanks for giving me that opportunity. Yeah, so what you said, Stan, is absolutely right. There has been more interest in this Dutch election, even in Flanders, right, which shares, of course, a language, maybe less so in Wallonia, because there is a sense in Flanders as well that the landscape, the political landscape, is in flux, right? Even people of my parents' generation are not sure what to vote for anymore. And these are people who've always voted Christian Democrat, always voted Liberal, always voted Socialist, felt very comfortable with this. And I think it's around this figure of Pieter Omtzigt, right? This kind of outsider insider, right? Who started his own party, then wasn't clear about whether he was going to be wanted to be prime minister or not. And then, of course, I think he kind of shot his chances a bit in the last week by saying he wanted a cabinet of technocrats, right? And so you can say this in Italy because the Italians have experience with this, but I think in Northern Europe it's more problematic. We can get into this, but there was this hope, I think, for a short period in Belgium, at least in this political center, that it was possible to kind of renew from the center, right? And talking about economic security and talking about anti-corruption. I mean, these are things that most reasonable people can agree on, right? And it seemed that this Dutch election was breaking this populist trend until last week, right? Because it seemed like Wilders wasn't getting anywhere this time, and that this was going to be probably relatively sensible center-right or center-left cabinet, depending on kind of where the chips fall. And I guess we'll know in the 16 minutes we'll have a better sense of this. But so I think it's also important, this election and what result we get for Europe, because we're kind of in the middle. I mean, I imagine Constanze will talk more about foreign policy and security. I'll focus on the kind of political economy and the fiscal side of things. What's interesting about the Netherlands in the EU monetary fiscal union debate is that it was almost always more German than the Germans were, right? So in this debate that we've seen in the last 20 years of what kind of Eurozone, what kind of economic union, what kind of single market, single currency governance we want, there's this, it's often been framed, especially since the Euro crisis, as a kind of, northern sinners versus southern, northern saints versus southern sinners debate, right? Where the frugal northern countries, like Germany, like the Netherlands, like Austria, like the Baltics, right, who balanced their budgets and so on and kept their fiscal houses in order, that should be the way for the whole union. And then, of course, in Southern Europe, they tended to have bigger deficits and were more demand-driven economies rather than kind of export-driven economies. What's interesting, and we've seen this kind of came to the high moment of Dutch frugality. The leader of the Frugal Four, the Frugal Five, came in the summer of 2020, when Rutte kind of led this very strong, strict coalition against this Franco-German compromise to have what now is known Next Generation EU, this dramatic kind of recovery program that was going to be financed by joint bonds, jointly issued through the European Commission. And it was really the Netherlands who led this coalition against. What's interesting is that since that moment, there's been elections, and the biggest shift there is we went from a Dutch finance minister from the CDA, Wopke Hoekstra, to a finance minister from D66, so the kind of liberal Democrats, if you want, because they sit together with VVD in the Renaissance, right, in the European Parliament, which is interesting because it's kind of a left and a right.
Well, we have too many parties for the European family.
So by definition. And so Sigrid Kaag had a very different view, right, of kind of where Europe should be headed. They were more worried about climate change, and then, of course, with the Ukraine war, they were also much more worried about defense. So it didn't seem like you could have fiscal austerity on the one hand and strict rules on this, and then combine this with all these ambitious targets for climate, for security, for defense, and so on. And what's even more interesting in the last few months, years even, is that the Franco-German engine of the European Union was really not working that well anymore, right? I mean, Macron and Scholz don't really get along, right? I mean, they understand they have to get along, but there's not much lust lost there. But who does get along is the Spanish finance minister and the Dutch finance minister. They're both women, they're both same generation, and they're both progressives, right? And so Nadia Calviño, who's now chairing these Eurogroup meetings and trying to come to a compromise of how to rewrite those fiscal rules, had a great ally in Sigrid Kaag from D66, from the Netherlands, that was always more frugal than the Germans, right? And so there was this sense, at least until the summer when the Rutte cabinet fell, and there was this high uncertainty in the beginning about what Spain was going to look like, right? That this was now the new, I don't want to say Franco-German engine, but at least you had Spain and the Netherlands, two sides of the sinners and saints debate, that really found a sort of compromise deal that was in the works. So now what's happened in just the last few weeks, a few things. There's been another German Constitutional Court ruling, the Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe, that said whatever this new German coalition is trying to do when it comes to climate and defense and so on, all the off-budget spending is non-constitutional. And so there's a major hit for European flexibility, because here you have a German finance minister that needs to be more frugal than he was even dreaming of now. And at the same time needs to negotiate with the French and the Italians and the Spanish on making these rules more flexible. But I mean, that's a completely contradictory worlds, right? I mean, you cannot sell this politically, especially not for a guy like Lindner, a liberal, who's really, not very happy in a coalition with two progressive parties that want to spend more, and he wants to rein in spending. So if you think back over the last 20 years, the Dutch have always felt very comfortable.
Because just to clarify for people, Lindner very much is of the old school, I think, in the north-south divide, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if I think back of like 20 years ago, you had Gerrit Zalm, who was a liberal politician, openly criticizing the Franco-German reform of the Stability and Growth Pact in 2003, 4, and 5, when both Schröder and Chirac wanted to make rules more flexible. Then you, of course, famously had Jeroen Dijsselbloem, who suggested that Southern Europe had spent all their money, I believe it was on booze and women. and that, that shouldn't then come at the cost for northern bailouts. And then even Wopke Hoekstra, not that long ago, in the beginning of the pandemic, suggested, well, why do these southern European countries not have any fiscal space? Have they not done their homework in the middle of a pandemic that, of course, was very poorly received? The point is that this was nothing controversial in the Netherlands itself, right? This was very much, even my own parents, who are more Dutch than they want to admit, always say like, yeah, but that's exactly right, what these guys are saying, right? And so it was very poorly received in the rest of Europe and maybe in more sort of progressive circles. So now it looks like this result will be very important for where we will go in Europe, because as much as Nadia Calvino hopes to get a deal in a few weeks, when Sigrid Kaag will still be the kind of acting finance minister, it's now also very clear that this could be kicked into January or February 2024, and that it's going to actually get a lot harder for Europe and the European Union, that has these great ambitions when it comes to climate and defense, that actually the money, or at least the fiscal package, won't be there. So I think that's why this election is actually goes well beyond the Netherlands.
And so you think both on climate and on European fiscal rules, it's really going to matter whether you get a center-right or center-left coalition here?
That's going to matter, and I think people will look at this elections also as a kind of prequel to what we will see in June, right? So if you see a shift to the right, which some polls have suggested,
when the European Parliament,
elections, yeah. And so if because there's already good polling that shows the Greens will lose in June in all of Europe, right? And it will be at the gain for the kind of the right-wing parties, the more Eurosceptic parties, and so on. And that will have real consequences for policy.
Very good. Thank you, Matthias. Constanza, as Matthias suggested, you may want to talk more about the security side of the European dimension. Thank you.
Well, first up, thank you for inviting me on this panel. I believe this is my first time in this building, and I'm very glad to be the last speaker, because usually the last thing the Dutch want to hear from, want to have is advice from Germans. So I was asked to come here and speak, just so you know. Didn't invite myself. I have a linguistic note, Bestandssicherheit. That is obviously I'm murdering the Dutch, but there is a German word, Bestandssicherheit, and it means more than, we have a common linguistic roots, obviously, and it means more than just economic security. It means maintaining the level which you gained, and which presumably you worked all your life for. In other words, it means not falling back between what you gained. And that is, I think, a thought that is, I think, uppermost in a lot of voters' minds, and not just in the Netherlands. That's a very powerful motif to play on.
And Matthias suggested we translate it as existential security, but that seems a little over the top, and it has all kinds of theological
I think it's maintaining your achieved status quo. I mean, that's not an elegant translation, but it's at least precise, right? Anyway, but you wanted foreign and security policy from me, and I will say the following. What's fascinating about the Netherlands is that it is a very small country that is extremely large economically, that is highly globalized, and at the same time manages to be quite parochial in some of its preferences. By the way, we Germans, large country, can do the same thing. But there is no universe in which the Netherlands could decouple from the global economy and survive, right? I think that's a really important thing to understand. The other thing to understand is that, and here, bear with me, but I have been told this by Dutch diplomats, Dutch diplomacy, more often than not, bandwagons on its neighbors, and more often than not, bandwagons on Germany. It's just an efficient thing to do. So it is we have, just by way of reminder, Germany shares frontiers, borders with 9 countries in Europe, and the Dutch are one of them. And we are one of those cases of, the Netherlands are one of the countries on which German foreign policy decisions or inaction can have massive consequences, and that we very often do not pay enough attention to. The other point here to understand that I think isn't generally known, the Dutch armed forces are practically fully integrated militarily with the German armed forces. No other neighbor of ours is as fully integrated with our armed forces as the Dutch are. It's certainly true for the army. And that too, again, means that when we make decisions or non-decisions, that has implications beyond our border, right? And it's just to explain to those of you who don't follow these things, like I have been, just how consequential our decisions are for each other in Europe. These aren't political decisions really anymore. We've just grown together so much that we're practically a tissue, right? That where national borders are somewhat irrelevant for the way policy is made. The Dutch, of course, are one of the founding members of the European Union, one of the founding members of NATO, have supplied NATO secretaries general in the past, and I think would be quite happy to supply another one in the near future, and are deeply transatlanticist, or are at the same time deeply transatlanticist and deeply pro-EU, right? While, as Matthias was saying, sort of very much in the frugal camp of political economies. And all of that is a preface to my key point, which is that the Dutch are, I think, looking at, as we all are, at something that approaches a perfect storm in European foreign and security policy for the coming 12 to 18 months. Right? We are all engaged in supporting Ukraine prevail against a Russia that has neo-imperial ambitions that are by no means confined to Ukraine. And we are struggling to help it do that, and Ukraine is struggling in consequence. We are all subject to the influence, and sometimes more than that, the very assertive and aggressive influence of China. China is extremely interested in European ports. The Dutch have some really important ports, right? In fact, the Dutch ports, Rotterdam, are the sort of end of the Belt and Road trajectory of European infrastructure, in which the Chinese take a very keen strategic interest. And finally, we're looking at an American election period in which it is not clear what the future holds for the American relationship with Europe. And we are all, I think most of us, unless we're on the hard right or on the hard left, deeply grateful, which I am neither, just making that clear. We're deeply grateful for American leadership and contributions in supporting Ukraine, but we're already seeing just how difficult that is becoming in this beginning presidential election campaign. And all of us know full well, or that although we might, I think, want to move from burden sharing to burden shifting, take on a much greater burden, which is, I think, what many of us now think we should, that is materially and fiscally an extremely difficult thing to do. Not least because the German Constitutional Court just shot up the coalition's budget plans.
Not strictly a Dutch topic, but can you elaborate on that a little bit? What are the actual implications we should expect from that?
So there are several. I was just going to get to that.
Okay.
The Germans, if you like it or not, right now in continental Europe are the sort of we provide a quarter of the EU budget, right? To the extent that the EU has gotten massively engaged in financial and also military support for Ukraine, that matters. And we were going to double our annual support budget for Ukraine from 4 billion to 8 billion. That is now in question because of that Constitutional Court judgment. And what that means is that the German coalition government, I think, in the coming months is going to be scrambling frantically to salvage its budget, will be, I think, politically very inward-looking, and that has consequences not just for Ukraine, but also for its neighbors. Frankly, I find this all terrifying. I have to say, I've been around the block a couple of times on European crises. I used to be a journalist, and my political life started with the genocides in Central Africa and the Balkans, which was, for a person my age at the time, barely 30, was already hair-raising enough. It was not what I had grown up with. And as a journalist, I went to Rwanda and to the Balkans and to Afghanistan later on. So I've seen some things. But what we are facing now really deserves the name perfect storm. And I fully understand Americans and conservative Americans who think we ought to do more. And while we have done a lot, and I think some of you recognize that in the past 2 years of Russia's full-scale invasion, I fully sympathize with those who think we could do more if we wanted. And I think objectively that's true. Politically, socially, that's going to be a really, really hard thing to do. But I will only say it to those of you...
You can do the math, right? So you say going from 4 to 8, if that's a quarter of the budget,
exactly.
that's very different from 100 billion, which is the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So where Germany goes, there the EU goes. And I think it is incumbent on us, Europeans, in the coming months, to be generous to each other, to be creative, and to exercise solidarity, because otherwise we're not going to get Ukraine and ourselves through what is going to be an extremely difficult 18 months. And that puts you just at 3 p.m. and the polls.
We're gonna pretend like we're not.
We need music, yeah,
We're
I know,
not
but
eagerly
that's...
looking for it. We'll in a few minutes we'll have the exit poll results up here on the screens. We're gonna let them be processed over there. No pressure. So I wanted to before we go to that, I wanted to give everyone a chance to respond to what we've heard. Certainly, Erik, you start off. Anything you heard that you want to weigh in on?
So let me first of all say that as the ambassador was saying early on, like the foreign policy was very low on the agenda, probably even less so than it has been in past years. There is no real division over support to Ukraine. Omtzigt has been very strong on Russia over his entire career, actually. For example, as a member of the Parliament of the Council of Europe. So regardless of sort of who emerges as a leader, I think from the Dutch side, there won't be that much change. Also, we'll hear more soon, I strongly suspect the current Dutch government might be sitting for a while, given the difficulty of these coalition agreements. So at least in the short run, of course, it's maybe more difficult for the Dutch to make larger concessions when you don't actually have a genuine government in place, but that hasn't really stopped past governments from behaving in these ways, I think. On the climate side, of course, there are going to be massive differences. If the GreenLeft and the Social Democrats emerge as first, and again, we'll soon know that will be very different than when the VVD or PVV will emerge as the largest leader. But overall, I don't expect the outcome of the elections to have very large consequences in terms of policy towards the EU or foreign policy more generally. So that was
very good.
Filling up at least a minute there.
Yeah. Matthias, Arthur. So the exit poll is now out. So based on this exit poll, the PVV, which is Wilders's party, will be the largest party with 35 seats, which is a lot more than the poll said. There was an upward trend in his numbers. The second largest party would be the GreenLeft Labour combination with 26 seats. The VVD 23 and NSC 20. So that obviously I think would have come as a major surprise to people just 2 weeks ago. It's not totally clear to me what kind of coalition we're going to put together here. The PVV, even though Wilders has been around for a while, he is the longest serving member of the Dutch parliament. After the election, I think of the 10 longest serving members of parliament, 8 are going to be from his party. And so that makes it particularly surprising. This is not a new party. Even though he's been around for a while, his party is still extremely radical, even by sort of the standards of sort of other European radical right parties, right? He still wants to ban the Quran, wants to ban mosques, wants to ban Islamic schools, right? Really viewpoints that are incompatible with Dutch law, with European law, with international law. On immigration, he holds very extreme viewpoints. And so until this campaign, basically every other major Dutch party had precluded forming a coalition with him. During this campaign, the new leader of the VVD opened, I think, the door to that to some extent, which really, I think, gave the PVV a new argument to make to voters, right, where they could say, you can now vote for us and we'll be relevant. And so I think that really, in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, really got Wilders to attract a ton of voters from the farmer citizen movement, from maybe the VVD even, from Omtzigt. And so now he's ended up being the largest party. He is a completely unacceptable option to the GreenLeft, Labour, Christian Democrats, everyone to the left of that. And so I think what's going to be crucial is what Omtzigt does, right? The VVD, PVV, and NSC together would be able to form a coalition. Omtzigt has, until recently, was pretty categorical in his refusal to govern with Wilders. Back when he was still a Christian Democrat, in the first Rutte government, governed with the confidence and supply, if not participation, of Wilders in the coalition. He was quite vocal in his opposition to that arrangement, and so he has a long-standing record. He has long been very interested in issues of religious freedom, and so it's not. I don't think that's going to be an easy move for him. But on the other hand, I don't know. You guys are the political scientists here. My sense is always that the politicians want to be in power, and so they're willing to make some compromises. You don't think that's going to happen here?
So my first instinct is not. I mean, and I don't. So the VVD leader has also said very clearly that she wouldn't want to serve in a cabinet that was led by Wilders, in a government that was led by Wilders. And especially now, I mean, if these numbers are correct, I mean, these numbers are way larger. So 35 seats would be a lot. So you cannot really ignore Wilders in that circumstance. So that might change the calculus a little bit. But with the VVD losing by this much, I do not expect that they would want to join a coalition with Wilders, and I do not expect that NSC would want to do that either. But I mean, it's of course very risky to make predictions, certainly after 1 minute of hearing the exit polls. But I wouldn't be so surprised if we do not get a government at all, actually, and if there would be leading to new elections, basically. That would be, I mean, that's maybe a bold prediction, but that would be my instinct upon first hearing this news.
I see. Constance?
Yeah, let me perhaps just try and contextualize this in sort of a broader European context. I found a piece in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung quoting Wilders, who has notably, I think you were saying, toned down his rhetoric recently. And the quote is, he was willing to put his radical position on ice, quote unquote, temporarily, in order to enable a right-wing alliance. That is behavior that we have seen across the European hard right. We've seen Marine Le Pen moderating her rhetoric. We have seen Meloni being pragmatic in government. But to any of you who follow, let's say, French or Italian politics more closely, the truth is that this is tactical behavior. If any of you saw Meloni's recent suggestions for constitutional reforms, which is that the key element of which was that the winner of an Italian electoral vote should automatically get 55% of the votes in Parliament and the seats in Parliament, regardless of their actual vote share. I mean, that is pretty much moving the Italian constitution towards one-party rule. Marine Le Pen also has in no way in content become more moderate. The only exception to this, as is I think somewhat well known, is my own country's Alternative for Germany, which is proudly radicalizing in full view, and is in no way moderating its language. So this, in many ways, I think what happens here is also going to be a bellwether for the rest of Europe. And of course, as some of you will also know, the European hard right has several figures, leaders of the hard right, have stated their ambition of making real gains in the European Parliament election, then gaining sort of hard right commissioners in the EU, and if possible, dethroning Ursula von der Leyen. I think that's probably a step too far, and I also always think there really isn't a hard right Ummah. I have a hard time seeing them muster enough political cohesion to really sort of push through a common political platform. But it is remarkable that is the stated goal and is something to be watched closely.
Yeah, I think Eric's first reaction was very much on point with what I was thinking, but I'm still kind of interested in what is you can do the math, I think, with the numbers. Like, what is if the other parties agreed on a coalition to keep Wilders out, as hard as it might seem given the current results, what would that even look like?
So it would look like VVD, NSC, GreenLeft, Labour plus D66. So they, based on the exit poll, they would have 76-ish seats, and so it depends a lot on how accurate the exit poll is, but that would be the 79. Okay. So there's a little bit of margin there. So that would be one possibility. I mean, I don't know that the PVD would have signed up for that 2 weeks ago, but I mean, on some level, I think they really miscalculated by opening the door to Wilders and making him newly relevant, because it really felt for the past 10 years that he had basically lost his influence. He's part of the parliamentary proceedings, but seemed to have been completely disqualified from any kind of participation in government. And I think by opening the door, that drew, I think, voters to him who otherwise wouldn't have wasted their vote on him. I think so. What Eric said about the new leader of the VVD not wanting to participate in a government led by Wilders, obviously has now become extremely relevant. And I agree. I think for them, look, obviously the calculation they made in opening the door to him was to signal to voters, you can vote for us and hope for a right-wing government. I don't think what they wanted was to, maybe rely on his support. Certainly don't think they wanted that to lead to a government with him as their leader, right? It's one thing to have him, providing votes in parliament. It's quite different to have him be the leader of the government, which strikes me as a completely inconceivable option. So here we have the exit poll in orange for those of you in the audience, and so you see NSC, obviously going from 1 to 20, which is a major victory. You see the BBB, the pharmacism movement, with a small gain. This is way below where they were polling just a few months ago, way below where they were in the Senate. And so I think a lot of those voters have gone to the NSC and to Wilders' party. You see the Christian Democrats, who are part of the incumbent government and sort of over the past 50 years, the largest Dutch political party. They have gone down to 5 seats, which is about what was expected to happen. D66 in the end performing relatively well. I think 10 seats is at the high end of their polling numbers. But really the big surprise here, the big development is the PVV doing this well. Of course, these are exit poll numbers. Dutch exit polls are usually quite reliable. I think last time around, the largest deviation in final results relative to exit polls is about 3 seats. And so if you think of that as the sort of high end of the margins, the PVV would be the largest party. The new GreenLeft Labour coalition has done quite well. I think this is a result they were hoping for. Of course, they thought that with 26 seats they might win, which hasn't happened. Matthias.
Wow. This is, I mean, again, with the caveat that this is relatively accurate, and don't forget, it could move either way still, right? Like, Wilders could get even more seats, right? I mean, by that logic,
right.
So let's be careful. But I think I share Eric's skepticism that this could lead to a government, because if you exclude Wilders, that basically means Timmermans becomes prime minister, because it's the only party that actually won. I mean, if you look at the current 4 coalition partners, they all lost, right? So it's going to be very hard for VVD, the former Rutte party, and D66 as losers, right? I mean, they lost a lot of seats, to go into a center-left government when the biggest party is far right, right? And then it's going to be very hard for Timmermans to lead a cabinet that has center-right policies if his whole appeal was to unite the left. So coming from Belgium, where our record, I think, is 541 days to form a government. Dutch are amateurs compared to us, right?
Belgian won up.
Exactly, always.
Yeah.
I have a very hard time seeing a government emerge relatively quickly from this, because again, it would be a government of a few losers, right? And there's going to be pressure to go into opposition. Yeah, and I also have a very hard time seeing Wilders lead a majority government, right? Because in theory the right has a majority with three parties, right?
That's right. So here we have the various seat numbers for possible coalitions. So this is how unlikely this outcome was. I didn't even list NSC VVD plus PVV as an option, but they would have a majority. I listed NSC VVD BBB as an option, but not the. It's pretty bad because I put 10 coalitions on here. You'd think I'd be able to get the most likely option on there, and yet. But so they would have a majority. You see some other. What you see here is that there really aren't that many other options, right? There's the NSC plus VVD plus GreenLeft Labour BBB coalition that I mentioned earlier, which has a slight majority. The other options basically all involve the PVV, and so those are the two possibilities.
But the hard right, you don't need the BBB, right? In theory.
NSC VVD.
That adds D66, I think.
D66 with D66.
And what's
Yeah.
religious white? Does that,
That's a
that
joke.
do right?
That has the white nationalist parties and the religious
I see.
parties.
Religious
Can
white.
I make a comment on this?
Yeah.
You know what we've just been describing here looks actually strikingly like what could happen in next year's 3 East German elections in Brandenburg, Saxony, and Thuringia, where the Alternative for Germany is currently polling between 34 and 37%, meaning that the democratic parties, and I say that because the AfD is very much not a democratic party, nor is Die Linke at this point, would have to form, if not a 4-way coalition, at least 3-way coalitions, but possibly in a place like Thuringia where it's 37, the AfD is at 37%, you could see 4-way coalitions. And again, with the democratic parties losing percentage points relative to the last regional elections, none of which is really good for representative democracy, right? So this is, in that sense also, what we're looking at here could be a bellwether for other elections in Europe, including in my country.
Matthias, maybe you can talk about, obviously, Antwerp, for example, has spent a lot of years in a similar situation, right, where there was a cordon sanitaire around the...
But I'm starting to think this is a bellwether for what the Flemish part of the Belgian elections in June next year will look like as well, right? Where because there, so from that point of view, I'm not surprised, right? The equivalent of Wilders' party, PVV, is the Flemish interest, right? Vlaams Belang, and they have been topping the polls for a good 2-3 years now, right? And 25, 26%. And so, but it's still surprising looking at the campaign and the last few weeks, because it was clear that Wilders wanted to frame it as left versus right, which then made the center kind of fall out, right? Because in the end, Omtzigt's appeal was to get beyond it. And so I think in the end, Timmermans did much better than expected because of the late surge of far right, which then was like, if you want to stop a far right government, you have to vote for me. Which
Didn't do that much better, but of course there aren't that many votes on the left.
That's true.
If you look here at this
But
bottom
still,
coalition...
26 seats seems like better than they had maybe hoped for.
But this bottom coalition, which has every party from the Christian Democrats to the left, right, a coalition of 9 parties, would still be only at 56, which is barely over 30% of the vote, which is it's pretty incredible. And let's go, Erik, and then Arthur.
Yeah, just I think one thing that's been going on in Dutch politics is that there's a very strong anti-VVD element in the right? And that's the VVD has been in power, of course, or has had the prime minister for the past 13 years. And so there's a strong sentiment among the right, people who care about immigration especially, and environmental policy to some degree as well, that the VVD is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And those voters first fled to the BBB, then to the NSC. And one thing that I didn't really mention, and I did mention in this Good Authority piece, remember Good Authority again, is that neither one of these leaders, of the BBB and Omtzigt, wanted to actually be prime minister. So the BBB leader said that she didn't want to wear high heels, and she literally said that, and that's a reason why.
She didn't want to travel abroad, she just wanted to fly.
She didn't want to fly. And that really led to a big decline in the popularity of the party. And Omtzigt, he ran on a good governance platform and then was basically unwilling to commit to be the governor, which was, again, I think very problematic in that leader. So it seems to me that a lot of those voters that are really on the right, but that are opposed to the VVD because they see them as part of the problem, part of the sort of party that has been in charge of what has created policies over the last, well, really even longer, 20 years, because that's how long they've been in government. And that's what you're seeing now in the PVV, and perhaps the more moderate language has worked that Wilders has had. But if that's right, then it also makes it a lot harder, I think, for the VVD to actually join that coalition. But the other thing, and this is the final thing I'll say here, 35 seats, or maybe even more, as Matthias was saying, that cannot be ignored, right? So he is going to get the first chance to form a government. It's really inconceivable, I think, that people will say, let's not give him a chance to form a government. So that could be a very
undemocratic.
well, yes. I mean, and that's not something. I mean, the voters have spoken, and parties will have to listen to that. So that may be sort of counterpoint to my first reaction is that if the NSC is serious about wanting democratic reform and listening to the voters, they will have to at least listen, hear what Wilders has to say. For Wilders, that would mean deviating very far from his party program in order to get any kind of compromise on the table, because his proposals are well outside, as I mentioned earlier, Dutch constitutional law, EU law, international law, the mainstream. And so it's also a question of whether he's really willing to go there. But I do think we're going to see him try, at least over the next month.
And in terms of process, as the ambassador explained, we'll see a vote of parliament to decide who gets to explore various options. Arthur, you wanted to say something, then let's take a few questions.
Yeah, so of course, it's very risky for me to speculate about politics as a simple economist, so it's kind of half like an observation, half a question to our political science experts. But, when I look at I found it interesting, of course, having climate and environment in mind, to think about if there's a very long process in which we try to form a coalition with Wilders and it doesn't work out. In some sense, if you look at those four parties, right, the GreenLeft, Social Democrats, D66, VVD, and NSC, when I look at their party programs, it doesn't look like those are spectacularly far away from each other. It's kind of the same range as in previous coalition governments. And I was kind of thinking, you could imagine seeing a deal where...
In fact, they have all been part of Rutte governments. Right?
Well, the NSC, of course, hasn't, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
sort of. Yeah, but you could see kind of a case where I think the two greener parties could get away with a big climate win. The other two parties could get away with a big win on immigration, and they would sort of see this as it's kind of like a bit of an emergency solution to sort of prevent a Wilders cabinet. And I kind of wonder, and maybe it's also a question to like, why is that such a strange prediction? That's maybe my question back to the political science experts.
Can I answer? I mean, it's exactly what Belgium had with the famous Vivaldi coalition, right? That's now losing everywhere left and right, which basically had green, yellow, red, orange, and blue.
And it's called Vivaldi because of the...
Four seasons.
That's right.
Something for everybody and every season, right? And it seems to me you can hold it together for much longer, but then the question is what happens at the next election, right? So it seems very unappealing for the losing parties to join that, I would think, right? Especially if VVD looks at what happened to the liberals in Belgium. They've been decimated on the Flemish side because they've been governing so long. As Eric was saying, right? They're now, for many right-wingers, part of the problem. And so to do this again after, 20 years in government? To join a coalition that's led by a socialist, it seems very unappealing to me for them, from their point of view. Eric?
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, well, the whole election result will feel unappealing to the VVD, but unfortunately, they can't change that, right? That's those are the facts. But I do think that it is not. So we have this tradition in Dutch politics, especially parties of the center, like D66. They'll join the government and then they'll lose terribly in the next election, and they'll win again, and then they'll join the government and they'll lose again. I think it's been going on since the 70s or so with D66.
Well, they can't lose that much more this time. So
they can't. No, but
You never know. That's what the Christian Democrats used to think.
Yeah. So they may see that it's their time to sit in opposition for, but it's unclear whether they have that option. Now, I do think, I mean, it could happen, of course, that there will be circumstances, as Constance was pointing out, like we're at a really critical time. There could be circumstances that force more of a unity response. I mean, the world might force such a coalition. They won't be inclined out of their own volition to do this, but there might be a forcing event that would form a more sort of...
I think it is always helpful to look at what the programs of the European hard right have to say about Russia and China. That will focus the minds.
Yeah, so, I mean, and Wilders is a case in point, right? He wants to end Dutch support to Ukraine. So Islam and immigration aside, he wants to end Dutch support to Ukraine, has been in the past very, very comfortable with Putin as a figure, as a leader. And so that's another complication that you would think the DVD would be concerned about. Let's take a few audience questions. And then at the end of the event, we can all predict what the next go. Let's go over there in the back. Please wait for the mic. And then please introduce yourself, and then a question that ends in a question mark.
Thank you. My name is Geert Almakinders. I have a question to Eric. Basically, building on what Arthur was saying, that the degrees of freedom in terms of environmental policy are pretty limited. What about immigration policy? And also, to what extent has there been transparency about it? To what extent has that been explained by the different parties, what they want to do and what they can actually do? Thank you.
So in immigration policy, so there is actually a shared concern about immigration, which is really driven again by these socioeconomic concerns about housing and the welfare state that is shared among the left and the right. The reason, I mean, the last cabinet fell over what seemed like a fairly small measure, right? It was about asylum seekers and about family reunification policies, and especially the Christian rights, or the Christian Union and D66 were not in agreement over limiting family reunification for asylum seekers. It wasn't like a massive policy change.
It was small numbers, and it was about delaying family reunification, not even really changing it, right? It was really minimal numbers on an annual basis. Yeah. So those are the margins.
Those are margins. I mean, those are not really big changes in policy compared to, say, what Wilders wants, or a complete stop on immigration, work permits for EU citizens. I mean, that's how far out of line he is with regard to immigration proposals. So I don't think, the policy differences don't seem insurmountable to me on immigration. It's more, I think, a political calculus. I mean, I think Matthias is right. I mean, if you were, and you're right too, like if you look at the party programs, it doesn't seem like it should be insurmountable to have a coalition like that. Politically,
and to be clear, you're talking about a coalition of VVD, NSC, D66, GreenLeft, Labour.
Right, yeah.
Centrist, yeah.
More center, sort of a left to right. We used to call that purple, I think, in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we can still call it purple when there's greens in there.
Green, purple.
It messes up the color palette a little bit.
Green.
But so, and also, I mean, from the left, like having restrictions on students coming to the Netherlands is pretty popular among left-wing parties too, and even like restrictions on high-skilled labor. So there are some possibilities there, but I think it's more politically where it's very, very difficult for these parties to do this.
Yeah, the high-skilled, I think the main high-skilled immigration policy that will be on the table is to reduce tax benefits for high-skilled immigrants, right? Which is why on the left people may be open to that, because ultimately it's a tax increase. It's not a...
And it's fairness considerations, right? Like why do foreigners who do the same work as Dutch people have a better deal? I mean, that plays well, of course, politically.
Yeah. Let's go over here. Please wait for the mic.
Hi, hello. I'm Alan Jung, a student at Georgetown, where Prime Minister Mark Rutte visited in January. The Netherlands is famously the semiconductor powerhouse of Europe. Could the Netherlands seek collaboration with other semiconductor giants such as Korea and Taiwan in East Asia? And could the election results lead to a different approach in relation to those semiconductor giants? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think probably people here know that the Dutch, I think there were weekly delegations from The Hague, and for a while, and then the Dutch sort of caved to White House pressure, to join Jake Sullivan's famous small yard behind a high fence, right? Frankly, I think if there is a Trumpian or even a Trump administration, all bets are off on more than just semiconductors, right? I think it would probably, there would be a deluge and that would just, go into the general waves. I have a hard time. I have a hard time seeing another government, except one that was really led by the hard right, sort of changing that policy. But probably you know more about this than I do. I suspect the Dutch, once they sort of reluctantly arrive at a certain decision, stick with it, unless there really is a political upheaval in the Hague.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah.
To me as well. I think the policy status quo there seems like it certainly wasn't an issue during the campaign.
Yeah.
I mean, it was barely an issue when the export restrictions were put into place. It was.
Right.
I got the sense it got more attention here than it did in the Netherlands, which I don't know if you agree with, but certainly not. It certainly wasn't a major issue. I would say, and during the campaign, it just didn't come up at all. Any other questions? Comments?
Can I ask one?
Yes, of course.
Has there ever been a serious debate in the Netherlands about having a 5% threshold in Parliament?
Yeah, so there is
We have one that seems like an obvious thing to ask about.
it comes up regularly. So I think there are two main arguments against it. Right, one is there are a couple of relatively small but long-standing Dutch political parties that would fall below the threshold, probably specifically the SGP, which represents a set of very strict Orthodox Protestant denominations.
Yeah.
And so I think people would not want to exclude that group of voters from having their own specific representation. I think, and the other argument is the straightforward one, that it makes it much more important for people to vote strategically, and especially when you start from this kind of status quo, the first few elections is going to be very difficult to decide whether to vote for a party or not.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think in Germany it's been less of an issue in recent years, but of course in Israel, the current government is in place solely because of the threshold, right? Because the left just lost like 3-4 seats because of parties that fell just below that. And so I think people are hesitant about that, but it's a debate that occasionally comes up. An alternative that I think would be more reasonable would be to impose minimum group sizes in the Dutch parliament and restrict maybe if you fall below, if you don't form a group that's large enough, you're limited in your ability to ask oral questions as opposed to written ones, staff support. Yeah, so exactly.
Right.
And obviously every Dutch party operates in an environment like that in the European Parliament, where they, because we have more parties than there are groups in the European Parliament, so quite a few of them are used to working together at that level.
With each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's a more reasonable option. I don't think it's on the table at all, but that's an option.
Okay.
Of course, the fact that the PVV is now in this exit poll, by quite some margin, the largest party is also a result of this, right? In a much less fractured party system, you wouldn't have a situation where 20% of the vote, 22% of the vote makes you the largest party. And in fact, it's a relatively recent development. Until not that long ago, the largest Dutch party would typically have around 50 seats, right? That was true for Labour, for the Christian Democrats. It was true for the Christian Democrats as recently as 20 years ago. And so
in Germany.
Yeah, exactly. But so part of, the fact that that further fragmentation is relatively new, I think also has meant that discussions about, those kinds of changes to the system haven't evolved to the point where there are concrete proposals. I think that's the answer to that. It's not really on the table. Any other questions from the audience? Let's see if our online viewership has submitted questions. I think the hashtag we use for people to submit questions has never been used. So I don't know how I feel about that. I have a number of questions. So, what if, say, and I think this is extremely unlikely, say there ends up being a government led by Wilders. What do you think the response would be within Europe to that kind of government? Because you think people say, look, we're used to Maloney now, we're used to the, you think there would be basically no backlash? Because I think 20 years ago,
No, because Maloney was not really a known quantity,
I see.
whereas Wilders is. I mean, Wilders has been so inflammatory for so many years that I think a Wilders who says, actually, you know, I've eaten chalk, as we say, I'm a different man, is just not credible, right? That is not going to happen. I think people would be shocked. Some of you may have seen Simon Cooper's piece in the FT on the weekend where he said, you know, this is the new sort of moderate right, and included Sarah Wagenknecht in that. And that, I mean, honestly, I really like Simon Cooper's writing, but that one I think is way, way, way off base, right? I think is wrong on several counts. But maybe, but I'm being sort of emphatic here in order to generate disagreement.
But
so.
I'd say personally, I'd agree with Constanze. That said, I mean, it's a lot less scary for many people today because of Meloni, because of, I mean, there's the two models for far right, or Orban or Meloni, right? And that's the big question about Le Pen, right? Let's say Le Pen wins in France in 2027. Will she be more like Orban or more
and this
like
will be a
Meloni?
coalition, you know, obviously his room for maneuver will be limited.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, right? We've moved very far from the international response to Haida. And the FPÖ first became part of the Austrian government, right? Which would be more comparable, I think, directly to this situation.
That said, they look in Brussels at this very worried because it does mean that, I mean, there was this brief moment, I feel like in 2020, where there was this belief, especially amongst cosmopolitan elites, that surely with the pandemic, people will want, you know, serious people in government, right? And not, this is the end of populism, it dies right there. And it clearly hasn't, right? Because and it's more mixed, right? I mean, when you have Poland, you have Slovakia, right? You have this sort of result. I think this is unexpected, though, assuming this holds, right?
Yeah.
And it does mean a further shift to the right in probably much of the European Union elections in June 2024, which, yeah, I mean, makes a possible coalition that's further to the right than the centrist coalition that we've had more likely. Doesn't mean it's going to happen that way, but I mean, 35 seats. I mean, he's doubled seats, right? More than doubled in this case.
Yeah.
He's 9 seats ahead of Timmermans in this. That's why, again, I'll repeat. I have a very hard time seeing Timmermans emerge as prime minister with a majority cabinet that's broadly centrist, because you're kind of ignoring the Wilders elephant that way. And he won't govern from the right, Timmermans. He can't.
No, yeah,
right?
obviously.
Yeah.
Can I add an aspect that we haven't mentioned at all here, which is the Israel-Gaza war and its impact on our relationship with Jewish and Muslim citizens in Europe. The Dutch have, in per population count, one of the highest proportion the largest Turkish minority per capita in Europe, right? You also have significant Arab minorities, and they're probably, like everywhere else in Europe, 10 times as many as your Jewish citizens, right? The events in Israel and Gaza are translating directly, right now, at least from what I can see, in my own country, into increasing tensions domestically. And that is also going to play in, and that's going to be a very big test for Geert Wilders as a responsible politician. If he uses the kind of language that he has used in the past...
I think it's part of the explanation for his success, for sure. Yeah.
It's entirely possible. All I'm saying is he now has the choice whether he dials up the heat, right, and which could lead to really an explosive political situation. Plus, what also plays into the Netherlands but isn't present in Germany, because we lost our colonies in the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, you, like the Belgians and the French and the Brits, have very significant percentages of your citizenry that have, for better or for worse, decolonization stories, right? And that have a conflicted relationship with their roots, their non-European roots, and their citizenship in Europe. And Wilders has a choice here, right, of kicking this beehive, right, or being a responsible politician, and it may be determinative for the future of the right in Europe, right? So this is something I think to be watched very, very closely, certainly given his past his past postures.
Yeah, I think it's. I think it's so central to his identity as a politician and
Absolutely.
to his party that I don't know how he
How does he not, right?
how he can moderate on that.
Right, exactly.
It's interestingly what you may think of as a Turkish nationalist party, DENK, looks like they lost a seat. They ceased originally. That party originally seceded from the Labour Party mostly over attitude toward Turkey, Erdogan, and so if you think of that as being on the other side of that divide, that party does not seem to have done better than it did previously. But yeah, anyway, so are you ready to predict what's going to happen?
No.
Okay.
So, I don't know.
The Dutch panelists have to predict.
So I'll try to predict. Well, first, I want to say that, like in past elections, so the last provincial elections, the farmer citizen movement won. The provincial elections before that, actually, we haven't talked about that, the Forum for Democracy, which is another far-right party, all of a sudden won and then got decimated afterwards. We've seen the same with BBB. Wilders is, of course, a much better known quantity, and these are parliamentary elections, not provincial elections. So there was a story in the Netherlands a little bit that voters may be a little bit more irresponsible in provincial elections than in parliamentary elections. But one story is that some people, at least in the Netherlands, will see it like that, right? They will see this as a somewhat unusual result. But it's happened before, of course, in these Dutch elections. And the Forum for Democracy, led by Thierry Baudet, maybe even more extreme than Wilders to some degree, became the largest party sort of suddenly. Yeah, so I think I'm going to stick with my prediction of Wilders getting a chance to form a cabinet, not succeeding, and perhaps Timmermans also getting a chance and also not succeeding, and new elections within a year. That's going to be my prediction. I'm usually wrong, but that's my prediction.
Good. All right.
Any other predictions, Arthur?
I buy his version.
I mean,
unless it's seen as it's the statesman thing to do, right? I mean, a lot can happen in 2024 if Constance's perfect storm materializes. Then, I mean, the same thing happened in Belgium, right? We finally had a government in 2011 because of the euro crisis, and suddenly it came together very quickly. So, I mean, I'm not predicting a crisis here, but that seems to be the caveat to, I think, Eric's scenario, which, when he started speaking 2 minutes after the exit polls, I was like, there won't be a government out of this. But
I mean, I think it's probably still the most likely outcome. I think I still assign a higher probability to like a lot of theater, and Wilders is going to try, it's going to fail, and then it's an unusual situation where the other 4 parties or 5 parties feel, well, it's not ideal, but it's a really difficult time. We need to sort of step up. And I think, like, so you mentioned the Four Seasons coalition. I viewed it a little bit differently. Like, the Social Democrats used to be very left and a little green. I think these days you have 2 parties that are very green and maybe a little left. So I think I see it sort of more of a green-right coalition that could emerge, which I don't think is quite as kind of all over the place as we've heard before. So I think I'm willing, just for the sake of the discussion, to assign a higher probability than the average panelist here to that being the final outcome after, say, 6 months of drama.
I see. All right. Well,
immigrants, more green policy.
Well, I'm gonna try and do something a little more exotic. So I think I agree that for the first 3 months we'll have Wilders, VVD, NSC negotiating. Then Omtzigt decides he can do it, and then we move to a negotiation that involves VVD, NSC, BBB, and GreenLeft Labour. That negotiation goes on for a while. Labour and GreenLeft splinter, and we get a government that is VVD, NSC, Labour, BBB, and maybe D66.
So who's the prime minister of that?
The prime minister is Dilan Yeşilöz. Remember that after Labour and the GreenLeft splinter, Labour isn't that large anymore, and so the VVD is the largest party in that coalition. That's how it works out. We have one last question over there in the back. Please wait for the mic. And then.
Yeah, hi, André Veuger. I'm the head of the political department at the embassy, usually trying to explain US politics, and now puzzled to explain my own country here. So that's going to be a task for the coming months. briefly, when we talk about the possibilities of Wilders forming a government, and I want to refer that to the audience, but also to the esteemed speakers. In 2010-11, Wilders was part of a majority government where he tolerated effectively the policies of Rutte. That government collapsed within 100 days. But there were some interesting developments, I think, some interesting aspects of the way that coalition tried to run the government for those 100 days. And in my view, if I remember quite well, and having been somehow directly involved, I noticed that at that time, Wilders took a very pragmatic approach. And he tuned down his voice, I would say, on quite some topics. So my question would basically be, if he were to be somehow as pragmatic as he was by then, what kind of topics would you see a potential for that? And could that eventually lead to a government? Otherwise, I fully share your view, Stan. We will have a first round of negotiations with the PVV, will collapse, other will fall out, and we'll be back here next year to discuss the results of the next elections.
That's right. So, I mean, I think in that scenario, right, what you could imagine, I don't think this is super likely, but you could have a coalition, him with the VVD, maybe BBB and NSC, where Wilders is not the prime minister, Wilders is the prime minister, or maybe Omtzigt. You know, not clear what kind of posts the VVD would occupy in that cabinet, but that's what the government would have to look like. On immigration, you could see some of the policies that Erik talked about, right? Dutchification of higher education, some marginal changes to asylum policy, and maybe the tax changes for high-skilled workers. And then other than that, you know, sort of the policies you'd expect from the rest of the coalition. I think that would have to be the scenario. I mean, I think also just for practical reasons, I mean, Wilders has long been under pretty stringent security protective measures. I think it'd be difficult for him to function as prime minister, and so maybe he would just remain in parliament, and members of his party would be in the government. I think that would have to be the setup, but I don't know. We're all speculating here. I think that's a possibility. All right, with that, we've reached the end of our time here. Thank you all for participating. Thank you all for coming. Have a good day.